So ladies and gentlemen, our next session is on the topic, do managements also run business? Well, with an increasingly heavy compliance workload, the time available to managements to focus on business has reportedly reduced. Are we losing sight of the fact that the primary responsibility of managements is to run business? He was named as the Chief Operating Officer. In the latter capacity, he led CRISIL's acquisitions and change agenda while creating growth path for the businesses he managed. Prior to joining CRISIL, he was the CFO of Indus Towers. He has rich experience of over 2 decades in telecommunications, oil and gas, FMCG and business advisory services, and has held leadership positions in BP Castrol India, EY and ExxonMobil India. He is a member of SEBI's Primary Markets Advisory Committee, FICCI's Capital Markets Committee, and CII National Committee on Financial Markets, Mr. Amish Mehta.
Thank you.
Our next panelist, please welcome Mr. Tapan Singhel. He is the Managing Director and CEO of Bajaj Allianz General Insurance Company. He has been with the company since its inception in 2001 and has been involved in various international projects such as setting up of retail businesses for Allianz in China and bancassurance development in the Asia-Pacific region. He is the Chairperson of General Insurance Council, Chairperson of IRDAI panel to promote e-commerce in insurance, and Chairperson of the CII National Committee on Insurance and Pensions. He is also a member of IRDAI Advisory Committee on Reinsurance and is on the Insurance Advisory Committee. He also holds the title of Honorary Professor of Practice from Chandigarh University, Mr. Tapan Singhel. And we also have Mr. Damodaran for the session, and our moderator for the session would be Mr. Mehta. Over to you, sir.
I'll just make a brief comment before you start.
Sure.
Am I audible? Can you hear me at the back? Yes, thank you. Sumit, can you request people to come inside? I think, yeah.
We request all our esteemed guests outside to kindly join us back in. We are starting the session right away. Requesting all our esteemed guests outside to kindly join us back. Thank you.
So while they are getting in, let me tell you why I am here. My name is again not for this session. In the handbook that you have, you will find the name of Mr. Pieter Elbers. Pieter Elbers is the Chief Executive of Indigo. He had a personal tragedy in his family. He's flown back to Amsterdam. A senior member of the family passed away. And therefore, when that was communicated to Amish, my dear friend, head of India's largest rating agency, he told me that I should join the panel for fear of getting rated badly otherwise. So I'm here to protect my personal rating in Amish's book. He said there's no way that this slot can remain vacant, and therefore you must come in. Therefore, that's why I am here, replacing Pieter Elbers.
Thank you, sir. So it's an honor and pleasure to be here and be invited to this esteemed gathering to talk about topics which are normally not spoken so openly and easily, right? It gets spoken in smaller groups, but I think this is an initiative which close to my heart, and I think Mr. Damodaran really takes it to a different level when he gets all the senior leaders out here, members of corporate India, independent directors, executives like myself, and it's an honor to be here. So, welcome to you, Tapan, as well. So let me, and then the topic, it's an interesting topic. First of all, it's very difficult to figure out when this thing came, do managements also run business? And, it took me some time, and I reached out to Mr. Damodaran. I said, maybe you have given me the wrong title of what you want me to talk about. And then, he spoke about some examples of how it's something which is to be thought through in a fashion that are you really doing what you are supposed to do as a management? Or where are you really spending your time, as a management, as a board? Is the pendulum swinging, right? And when I say pendulum swinging, let me, talk about, it's a rhetorical question, but let me talk about some of the examples of what's evolving in this environment, and all of us have to deal with that evolving environment of VUCA world. We see a lot of geopolitical changes happening. We have seen elections happen globally across the world, which could mean different policies, different regulatory environments. Businesses will have to react, maybe plan differently. We are seeing shifts in consumer preferences. Post-COVID, we have seen a lot of change in behavior, right? Digital going up, consumer preferences are changing, digital models are evolving. So there is another change happening. Another big change happening is on the technology side, Gen AI. All of us 2-3 years back, I don't think ever imagined the conversation changing and shifting from a Gen AI perspective. What does it mean to you from your own business perspective? What are the processes likely to be impacted? How can we leverage Gen AI for better consumer preferences, for gaining revenues, protecting yourself from a cost perspective? What sort of models are going to emerge? What sort of companies are going to emerge? So, change in technology. And I think for companies which are regulated, or even for companies which are not regulated, like Gen AI coming in, governments and policy makers have started thinking, what do they need to do to really react, to make sure they are protecting, they are defending? How do they ensure that the companies are resilient, economies are resilient, and you are able to address some of these challenges which are coming up? Risk going up from a cyber security perspective. All of us saw an incident how CrowdStrike got impacted and there were boarding cards being written manually at the airport. Can you imagine the disruption which happened on that day? You don't have the flight list, you don't have the list of passengers. Suppose the wrong passenger goes into the wrong flight, security concerns, the chaos that it would have triggered. How do regulators deal with something like that, right? An incident which happened outside India, but has a huge impact, and the impact was global. So another example of regulators need to evolve their thought process. I think climate change, and we had the previous session, we talked about, the social and the environment side of things. How do regulators react to getting companies to do what is right? Most large companies, good companies, I'm sure will do what is right and should be doing it. But there is a set of organizations which are there below, businesses which are there below. Maybe for them, profit comes before everything else. Do they really do everything in the right way, in the right spirit? How do you get more companies to follow the principles, to do what is right for the future, to make businesses think about future and not about the present? Again, something which regulators have to really keep looking at. And the regulatory environment is going to keep evolving. Listing regulations, we heard about BRSR in the previous session. So listing regulations, disclosure requirements, related party transactions, again, governance related matters which have come up in the past. How do the regulators, policymakers really look at some of these aspects and try and help create an environment, an ecosystem where you are able to balance, I think doing what is right and the same way doing in the right way. I think those are two important parts which I think everybody is wanting to look at. And if you think from a company's lens, I would always want to foster innovation. I would want to drive growth. I want to do things in an innovative way. And at times I would feel constrained because the policy guidelines or the guardrails will not allow me to cross those boundaries of trying to try new things. So how do you balance the innovation growth versus policy and regulation? And I think it's going to be very, very important to strive for accountable and responsive regulatory framework. Maybe something which I also want to say from a company's perspective, can compliance and regulatory risk managing become overwhelming, right, from an organization's lens? In regulated entities especially, when you are regulated, the risk that you run of non-compliance, even a small non-compliance could get magnified, right? So how do you manage the perception, right, of what you are doing? And I was talking to somebody today and he was saying that there are companies which have 1 million customers, and if it's a regulated entity and you might have 4 non-compliance on KYC, what is the regulator going to say? And if you just think of the example and you start wondering, what does it mean, right? Not that the entire system is not right, but it is just that maybe somebody missed doing something. And how do you explain it to the regulator? Or is the regulator going to do a tick and say, listen, for non-compliance, your design of the process is not good? How do you deal with that? And what does it mean for organizations? And I think this is where our regulators overreacting by using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Do you see that happening? One bad apple and you get regulations in, you get new requirements in for everybody to comply. What does it mean from a cost of compliance? It is going to be essential as we look at our strategy towards Viksit Bharat, right? Driving growth in India. How do we have global benchmarks? We want to do what is right. We want to compare with the best in the world. We want to get global benchmarks in, global standards in, but think global, act local. I mean, I think we have to really figure out, do what is right. And in the previous session, we spoke about sectoral frameworks. Again, it's an example where, what will apply to an energy company will not apply to a IT company. It will not apply to a banking company. It will not apply to an aluminum company. So how do you build, or metals and mining company, how do you build benchmarks which are relevant for people to understand? What are you comparing against? So do you need to find ways of disclosures which are relevant and help that process in the bargain? Let me just talk of another point of view around directors, right? So today you have independent directors who sit on multiple boards, 6 to 7 boards, large companies. Meetings are generally in 30-day period, right? So you have, and most meetings in large companies are today 1.5 to 2 days because of the requirements of different committees. That's a commitment of 14, 15 days. You get notice or papers 7 days in advance. So you can imagine the rush that you are looking at. Are you able to spend enough time in looking at some of these things? How do you space or balance the agenda? And I think we will have some views coming from both Tapan and Mr. Damodaran. Board spending more time on regulatory requirements, compliance requirements. How do you prepare for that? How do you guide the company in doing what is right? Balancing this equation. And I think that's an important part, especially for regulated entities. I think non-regulated entities, it might be a lower challenge. But for regulated entities, Tapan, for yourself and for me, something that we are mindful of. And I think we often ask the question to ourselves, are we spending enough time at boards asking the right question on strategy, on business, or are we spending time managing what the regulators are looking for, or the compliance requirements that we are supposed to maybe address, handle? Are we really talking about the quality of governance and oversight, or are we looking at micromanaging? That's another aspect that I feel important to ask that question, that are boards sometimes micromanaging, or are they doing their role as oversight? And then when I say micromanaging, you look at NRCs, you look at various committees of the board, and there are times when you can really cross that line, especially when you have a lot of directors who have served in executive capacity. Sometimes when they become independent directors or they are part of the board, they still feel they are running that executive position, and they think in that direction. Are we really having that dialogue at the board? So to me, I think there are various aspects of this, do managements really run business? And I would want to hear perspective from both Tapan and Mr. Damodaran. So maybe I'll request Tapan to share his view, and then we will open up for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think first and foremost, I'm very humbled and honored to be sharing the stage with Mr. Damodaran. He's been a regulator, he's been management both. He does not require both of us to be here. He can handle this alone, the whole session in terms of the question that you asked. But let me do something interesting for the audience here. You mentioned ChatGPT and the impact that it will have on businesses. Let's say what impact will it have on panels like this? So instead of me trying to answer your question, let me try to see if ChatGPT can answer this question and see up to what level. It's random. I have no clue what will happen. I'm just going to open ChatGPT, since he mentioned that, and see how does it react to the circumstances. And let's see. So it is like it can go anywhere, and let's just check this. Let me just get it on first. Hey, ChatGPT.
Hey there, how's it going?
Good. So I'm in a panel, ChatGPT, and the panel is on do management also do business. It's more on corporate governance. And I want your help. Could you answer this question for me? Do management also do business in terms of corporate governance and the role that board plays? And I'm in India. I'm sitting in Mumbai. It's more in the Indian context that I have to give this answer. Can you do it for me?
Certainly. In the context of corporate governance, especially in India, it's essential to understand the distinct roles of management and the board of directors. Management indeed runs the day-to-day operations of the business. They implement the strategies and policies set by the board and are responsible for the company's performance. The board of directors, on the other hand, provides oversight, guidance, and strategic direction. They ensure that the company adheres to good governance practices, acts in the best interest of shareholders, and complies with laws and regulations. While they don't manage daily operations, their role is crucial in steering the company and holding management accountable. In India, corporate governance has gained prominence with regulatory changes and a greater emphasis on transparency and accountability. The Companies Act 2013 and SEBI regulations have strengthened the role of independent directors, enhancing board effectiveness in governance. So, while management does run the business, the board plays a pivotal role in ensuring that the company's direction aligns with shareholders' interests and ethical standards.
Thank you, ChatGPT. I have some people from Tamil Nadu here. Could you just sum this up in Tamil? And also have somebody from France. Could you just sum this up in French also?
Of course. Here's the summary in Tamil. நிறுவன மேலாண்மை தினசரி நடவடிக்கைகளை நடத்துகிறது. அவர்கள் பலகையின் உத்திகளை செயல்படுத்துகிறார்கள் மற்றும் கம்பெனியின் செயல்திறனை பொறுப்பாக நடத்துகிறார்கள். பலகை மேலாண்மையால் மேற்கொள்ளப்படும் நடவடிக்கைகளை கண்காணிக்கவும் வழிகாட்டவும் கம்பெனியின் திசையை அமைக்கவும் முக்கிய பங்கு வகிக்கிறது. And in French, la direction gère les opérations quotidiennes. Elle met en œuvre les stratégies du conseil d'administration et est responsable de la performance de l'entreprise. Le conseil, quant à lui, joue un rôle crucial dans la supervision, l'orientation et l'alignement de la direction de l'entreprise avec les intérêts des actionnaires.
Thank you, ChatGPT. You're brilliant as usual. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
So, when you spoke about ChatGPT and businesses, we undermine the power of tech. See, it was random. I've not set it up. I can't prepare it. You asked me a question, I asked it, and it just gave a summary of, and I asked, I'm in India and I'm here. It gave a summary of what exactly management has to do, what board has to do, what is it. And then in any language, I said Tamil, French, German, Bengali, Marathi, it will sum it up also in times to come. So in every field of what we do, it's going to have a big impact. So because you mentioned that in your talk, I thought I'll just give you a perspective as you're talking about it. But coming to the point of do management also do, let me give some interesting examples. When a new CEO joins my industry and we are in some meeting, and I see that person a bit overwhelmed with what all is going on, so I call him aside and tell him, look here, young man or young lady, 70% of your time you'll do all this, and 30% of your time you'll spend on running the company. If you can't get this right, you're going to be in serious trouble. So when a person moves on from running businesses hands-on day in and day out to becoming a CEO, suddenly the person has a huge shift, and they do get overwhelmed because of the point that you have mentioned. And then they understand that this is a vital role that they have to play. And now the time spent in hardcore running business reduces, and how do they make that more efficient, and how do they relook at the structure and how does it go is something which is very, very relevant. I have been lucky with my board. Mr. Damodaran has been my board member. I had some of the finest board members that you can imagine. So a lot of guidance, vision came in. The micromanagement did not come in, and a lot of collaborative and constructive discussions came in. So my experience on the board has been different. But regulations, I've also been an advisor to a regulator. A lot of times we do keep on pushing the bar in terms of that, is it required? What will you gain? Was it relevant yesterday? Is it not there? Some listen, like the current regulator, I think he has been very nice. That perspective brought down from about 60, 70 regulations to 37. A lot of circulars have come down, trying to move to from rule-based to principle-based regulation. It's a journey which is happening. But having said that, I think the compliance, the regulations, when you look at from that perspective, is also required, and Mr. Damodaran can speak more about it. And from management perspective, how do you balance the two, and how do you still run a company well? But the fundamental remains the same. If you have people who believe in integrity and who have the courage to speak the truth, I don't think anything is required to be controlled. If you have a problem there, then whatever layers you may put on, it still will collapse. And we have seen over time across continents and across countries, the collapse keeps on happening. And that is from my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Tapan. Sir, would you share a few comments?
You see, when I conceived this panel, I wanted to have 3 serving executives on this panel so that we could hear from them whether they're actually running businesses, are they spending enough time running the business, they ought to be doing it. But unfortunately, my dear friend Peter Elbers had a setback in his family, had to fly back to Amsterdam, and therefore, as I mentioned, I'm deputizing for him. One thing I'm very grateful for is that for the last several years, I've held no executive positions. Therefore, I don't have to run businesses. Those that I'm associated with run themselves without any help, or hopefully without any hindrance from me. The reason I posed this question was, Tapan mentioned it, 70% of the time you're looking at all these things, 30% you get, which is a very charitable estimate. I have heard chief executives say that we don't get enough time to think about our business. It's like the situation in Alice in Wonderland. You're running very fast to stay in the same place because other things are moving faster than you want them to be, and the whole world lives on relativity. Now, the real issue is if managements are not running businesses as they are expected to, and I'll get to ChatGPT in a minute. If managements are not doing it, somebody must be running it. You know, in one state of India, the eastern state of India, where a leftist party was in power for many, many years, I ran into someone in the state secretariat and I asked him what explains the fact that the state is doing reasonably well. And he said that, you know, these guys who are running it don't believe in God. But God has decided, since they are not doing a good job of what they should be doing, God has decided to run it. So it's God that is running the business, something that these guys have not acknowledged. Now the question is, businesses will run for whatever reason, or they will shut down and die. How much is the management effort? When we look at the Indian situation, and this is the situation in the US also, because we live life quarter by quarter. Now, if you take one quarter, and every quarter you are expected to deliver better than the previous quarter, except for seasonalities that might kick in, how many working days are there in a quarter? So you don't have 90 working days in a quarter. Knock off the Sundays, hopefully the Saturdays, and the public holidays, and in something like 70 days, you are expected to deliver better results than in the previous quarter. Now, on top of that, you place the regulatory and compliance overload increasing by the day, which they have to cope with. So then the question arises, can management take a deep breath, reflect on where the business is, reflect on where the business should be? How can you take the business there in a manner consistent with regulations? I'm not saying for a moment abandon the regulations, far from that, but not focus excessively on regulations. I've been often asked this, do you think good corporate governance makes a good company? I said it's a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition. You need to have the right products, the right processes, the right markets. Simply having good governance is not enough. Now, who brings these other elements? The compliance matter can be regulated, can be prescribed by an external agency like SEBI or anyone else. But somebody ought to understand the business, run the business, compete in the marketplace in a very competitive environment. In that context, I asked myself this question, And luckily, as I said, I'm not an executive, I don't have to answer it. So these two gentlemen will answer it. What can managements do to focus more on business? To focus more on how they should run the company, because managements run companies at the end of the day. Boards don't run companies. Boards ensure that managements run companies. It's not the board's job to roll up its collective sleeves and run companies, far from that. So how do managements actually take out the time and commit that quality time that you need to run businesses has been a concern with me. You look at the agenda of most board notes, and Amish, you will bear me out. The first part of the agenda is all compliance items. And if you have, let's say, a longish meeting with a good heavy lunch, and most of the boards that I've been on, the lunch has been quite heavy for whatever reason. Post-lunch are the strategy items and the business items, and you can imagine the kind of intellectual rigor that goes into those discussions. Now, when you got the answer from ChatGPT on this, the one question that ChatGPT missed was, it told you what managements ought to be doing. My question is what managements are doing, what our managements are able to do given the constraints in which they operate. That's my question. I don't want to answer that. As I said, I am not an executive. Both of you are in executive positions. There are any number of executives here who will throw up the answers to. So that's the context in which I ask this question. Should we allow managements a little more time? So let me put it differently. Should managements carve out a little more time than they're doing now to focus on business as business, to the exclusion of which boxes you are ticking in order to keep the regulator happy and for you to sleep peacefully for 8 hours? If you do only that, then you can sleep for 24 hours because the business won't run. Somebody needs to actually commit time to the business. That's the context in which I raised this.
Thank you, sir. Let me share maybe one or two pointers towards what you mentioned, and Tapan, feel free to add to what Mr. Damodaran said. I think the culture of the organization, if you're a regulated entity especially, right, if you're looking at compliance or risk management as an example, whether you're non-regulated, how are you setting the culture? How are you embedding these things within the organization rather than compliance managing separately as a function? I mean, I have seen organizations where compliance is all powerful. They decide how to run businesses. And I have seen organizations where businesses know how to comply, and compliance is much more to make sure it's the next level of assurance. They are there to understand and make sure everything is in the right way, but the businesses run on autopilot because they own compliance. So that's one example where the management is able to focus on doing the right things and running business rather than thinking about compliance, because everybody's thinking about compliance in that fashion. I think the other pointer which I would say I've seen again from a board lens, we have seen criminal liability coming up for directors, right? That's something which I have seen, and suddenly directors become jittery about every aspect which they are supposed to comply or confirm. And then they start asking for validation, third-party validation, external confirmations, certification. They want a lot more detail. And how do you balance and how do you give comfort to those board members to understand? They don't take too much time in the board meeting. And if you need to, then you set up separate meetings to address that, but give enough and more time on the strategic aspect, on the business aspect. To the point that you are saying, Mr. Damodaran, I think, and it's a very practical aspect that when you decide the agenda for the meeting, you start with compliance. Sometimes some matter might actually get prolonged than what it was planned for. And the business agenda, you hardly have time because the meetings are, like I said, everybody's in rush for time. One thing which we have tried to do is that keep the statutory and the compliance agenda right at the end with enough time for that. Make sure that the business and the important items are covered. So you're not compromising on time, right, in the agenda setting itself. You agree in the planner upfront before the next year. So like now we are planning for the next year. What are the items you want to cover from a compliance risk perspective? How does the board want assurance? What is it that they want to understand? Spend separate time, if need be, set up separate off-cycle meetings to cover that so that you're not compromising on the time. I think this allows the management to then focus and make sure that they are not trying to manage the board. they're actually running their own businesses. Just some examples I thought I will share with you, sir. I mean, to the point that you made. Maybe Tapan, if there's anything you want to share.
Yes, I'd like to thank you. So first and foremost, sir, if ChatGPT answered your question, then you would not be required here. So it's good it didn't answer the full question. It can on the base...
Textbook theory.
Exactly.
I'm talking what's happening now.
Yeah, it takes in, sir, whatever is the past data that it has. From there it'll speak. If you put this data now, then it'll speak on this. So that is the beauty, and that's what, to my mind, when I speak to my people, you have to be ahead of the textbook theory, and the education system now has to change. Because that is now, it has come here. How do you go ahead of that is the question. Well, let me answer this question of yours. See, the fundamentals in an organization, the way I handle this is very simply. There are 2-3 things one has to look into. You have to see that your organization culture on integrity, when you say that we have zero tolerance for integrity issues, is lived and breathed at every last mile. The integrity has to be in the DNA of your organization. That is the first thing. Second, the transparency has to be at the highest order. If somebody asks you a question, just answer very transparently. Don't try to figure out what is the best way to put that data for the person. Make it very, very transparent and do it every possible time. And the third thing is be obsessed about what is good for customer. Now, if you take these 3 principles and pick up any regulations, pick up any compliances, pick up any kind of law of the land which would be there in any country, if these 3 are taken care of your organization, there cannot be anything else which goes beyond this. Everything which comes in is to take care of these 3 elements. Now, how as management you make it a kind of inculcation into the company, make it a DNA of your company of these 3 things. And people live and breathe that. It is not that it's something you just talk about in some open town halls and it's over. How do you demonstrate that over time consistently? Now, when you are able to do that and your organization culture gets built around this, then the point that you're mentioning, the time spent on compliance, the time spent on transparency, the time spent on putting up documents reduces, and that can also be given to people. Now, the problem for good leaders is not this. The problem for good leaders is to keep engaging with regulators and the ministry and the industry to keep on ensuring that the regulations move in the right direction. That also takes time. You have to be progressive to handle that. So you can't be just reactive sitting in a place and just be reacting to circumstances. If you do that, then you will, as management, always get overwhelmed. I guarantee that to you. And 90% of your time will just go trying to managing that. 1, build a culture which ingrains these 3 things. 2, proactively engage with regulators and the ministry to ensure that whatever regulations they're thinking about, or help them think through what is the control system that they're looking at, what has become obsolete, and keep on improvising that and don't react to what's coming to on that basis. And third, when you speak to your board members, let them have full access to your company at the root level or wherever they want to talk to, whoever they want to talk to. So they get the confidence of the highest level of transparency it comes to you. When you build these ideal circumstances, then you run businesses very comfortably while you manage all this together. Now, when you don't do this and don't go to the root level of it, then obviously you'll always be overwhelmed by the circumstances. That's my learning over time in terms of how do we look at this.
Thanks, Tapan. Sir, I want to ask you a question. You've been a regulator in the past.
Oh, 3 years out of 78. You were not here, but I think the rest of them heard. Yeah.
So from a regulator's perspective, right? I mean, I spoke about some events. Things keep evolving and changing, right? You had a cyber attack, or you had something else which might come up. How do regulators think about bringing new regulations in, right? And do they really consider the impact on business when they are actually bringing, or they are only trying to protect and defend? Sorry, I'm asking you for a question from an insider's view, your perspective, so feel free to.
Insider is a dangerous word in the securities market anyway. But that said, I answered your question in the morning session, that how do you address some of these issues? And I think regulators want to run businesses. Governments want to run businesses. I mean, run business not in the sense of public sector, that they abandon, right? But they want to run others' businesses. Regulators want to run businesses. Courts want to run businesses. They want to tell you how to run business. Except the management, everybody wants to run business. Management knows this is a difficult game. I'll give you an example from my past life. So about 2 decades ago, a little more than 2 decades ago, 23 years ago, when Unit Trust of India collapsed. So they needed somebody to go and do the last rites. And since I was floating around without any I must share this detail with you that I had applied for study leave thinking at that stage in my life I should study something. And my study leave was sanctioned. I haven't still started that study because then Unit Trust of India went through the tube and somebody identified this is the guy who doesn't have a job to do, so let's ask him to do that. I said, all right, I have this foolish problem of taking up things that shouldn't be taken up by normal, sensible guys. So when I went in there, the obituary had been written already. Now, we wanted to communicate to our stakeholders, our unit holders and others that there were some things that were wrong, bad practices, and we were setting them right, we had set them right. So I have, as an amateur, dabbled in the business of communications. And therefore, without any external aid, because we couldn't afford it, we couldn't have paid for it, we didn't have money, I conceived a short television ad because it was cricket season in India. Every season is cricket season in India, so it had contemporary relevance also. Simple, and those of you that follow cricket will understand this. So there was some guy releasing a ball. His face was not visible, you only saw the arm, releasing a ball. The batsman hit across the line, missed it, and the stumps got disturbed. No commentary, no voiceover, no nothing. And the second frame had the same guy releasing that ball, and we had a batsman, a reputed batsman, who agreed to do this ad for me because I couldn't pay him. He had to do it free of cost, playing it straight. And we had only one line at the end. At UTI, we no longer play across the line. That's it. That was the ad, and we thought that it was a message we needed to communicate. Guess what happened? I was very happy. My creative juices had worked. I tested it out on a few people who said it's very good, simple message, not costly to make this, no money involved except hiring a camera and shooting it, that is it. Somebody leaked this information to the securities market regulator, an organization about which I didn't think much till I actually got there. That's a different matter. And they promptly said, you cannot use a public figure in an advertisement because it will mislead the investors. It had nothing to do with investing. It was not Amitabh Bachchan saying you invest in this bank or something of that kind. This was only telling them that we are now playing straight, we're not hitting across the line periods, that's it. It was long before T20, now everybody hits across the line and makes runs, that's a different matter, right? But my regulator said, you can't do this. I explained to them that we're trying to run a business. It's laid flat on the floor, we're trying to get this chap up and not running, at least beginning to walk. And we need to communicate, but it didn't go through. That was the extent, continues to be, I suspect, the extent of regulators wanting to run business. Now you look at the banking sector. Bank boards often don't know what is happening, who is coming or going. I'll share something with you. He's going to be a speaker at one of our sessions tomorrow, Mr. Sunil Mehta. Mr. Sunil Mehta was chairman of the Punjab National Bank. Government in its wisdom decided that the chief executive should be replaced. And they found another gentleman with the name Sunil Mehta. And a good guy, good banker, I'm not disputing that. He runs the IBA now, or he was running the IBA, and appointed him managing director. So members of the board started getting telephone calls from their friends. I thought Sunil Mehta was chairman, when did he become managing director, and stuff like that. And the board members were blissfully unaware that the MD had been changed, because the board had nothing to do with it. The instructions came from the government. One extreme example. But in addition to that, you have directions on a continuing basis. You must lend so much, you must do this, you must open that branch. Day before yesterday, the finance minister announced that SBI will be opening 500 more branches. Is it a ministry announcement? Isn't this something the State Bank leadership should be announcing? the minister announced that SBI will open 500 more branches. So there are people wanting to do that. What do managements do in that kind of a context? You have targets, you have expectations from stakeholders, you are the guys that people outside the system are looking at, and yet, if your hands and feet are tied and you're thrown into the swimming pool, no prizes for guessing where you will land, at which end of the pool, right? So that's the context in which I am a little worried. Shouldn't some of these people, if they want to run business, actually take those jobs, or step back and allow people to run business? So I have a feeling that much as I've sat on both your boards, these have been exceptional chief executives, I've had the privilege of sitting on both the boards. But that's not the general standard. We call only exceptional people up here, so that is why you're saying these two gentlemen, right? But I can tell you that I feel for them sometimes. The kind of pressures that they are subjected to, which prevent them from doing business, and the tragedy is that it is all in the name of helping them to do business. So if I am making it very clear my job is to obstruct you, that's a different ball game altogether. Here I am actually telling them I want to help. Now you know these mergers of banks that took place. The boards of the banks did not know that these decisions had been taken. Or I'll give you a more interesting example. When LIC was told to take a major share in IDBI Bank, LIC's board was given 24 hours after the decision was taken. Mr. Thomas Matthews here, ex-LIC, I don't think he was on the board, by then he had left the board. 24 hours, and the insurance regulator cleared the investment of LIC in less than 1 day. So that's the kind of backseat driving that is taken place. All of us who have sat in cars know that if there is excessive backseat driving, it's a candidate for an accident. That's my worry, nothing else.
So I know there are some distinguished guests out here. Thomas himself is here, Nilesh is here, Sanjeev, Mr. Aga is here, Ramesh is here, Jamal, Mukesh. I mean, any perspective any of you want? You guys are sitting on multiple boards, right? You've got experience of dealing with companies, and how have you seen? You've seen regulated companies, you're seeing unregulated companies. Happy if you want to put any voice in the room for any of you to share.
I can say on Jamil's behalf that as our auditor on a company on whose board I was, he didn't try to run the company.
And I think we'll open up the floor as well. I think we've got 20 minutes, so let me try and make this more enriching for the audience. But if any of you want to share a perspective, I think Mr. Aga.
So I was very taken by your comment that if you do the right thing, but you have to be unself-conscious. If you're conscious that you're doing the right thing, you're very principled, you will start declining very fast. But I don't think you meant that. But if you're doing the right thing, if there is a culture of constructive people working together, and cultures are a very elusive thing, then frankly, compliance becomes a piece of cake. Now, I gave up work many, many years ago, and things have become harder. But I would tend to agree with you that the point Mr. Damodaran is making applies not across the board. In companies which have a smaller interface with the government or with regulators, and which are generally run on good principles, I don't think managements have a problem of devoting as much time as is required. However, I'm also aware, and I'm coming to Mr. Damodaran's side quickly, because he will give me lunch tomorrow. When I see some of my younger colleagues, when I see how banks are run, and although I'm told the Reserve Bank is a very enlightened, in fact, I was in a meeting and he was talking highly of the Reserve Bank just this morning, and that must be true. But on a bank board, you have to be crazy to go through the documents. And I was on a bank board briefly with Mr. Damodaran, again over a decade ago. It's become worse. And the kind of regulation and the kind of instruments to discipline, as if you're talking to a nursery student, you know, docking pay and stuff like that. Who in his right mind will get motivated, you know, if you have things of that nature happening? So some of the things are very primitive in certain sectors. And there are other sectors. Banking is a good sector. There's a compliance overburden, but there is no perversity. But then there are other sectors in India where angels will fear to tread, you know, which are not really meant for people sitting in this room to be getting into. So there is a big cross section, and I therefore wanted to agree with both of you.
Thank you.
But thank you, sir. I think your comment on not being controversy. The issue is when you look at culture of organizations and you take these 3 pillars and to the point that you mentioned, and you were to constantly work on it, cultures are not something that you just make it and forget it. It's a constant evolution that you have to be there and keep it there. And when you do that, and I'm from the insurance one, it's also very heavily regulated. So once you're constantly working on it, then the pressure from you as management on trying to fix those things comes down a lot, because then you're sure that even whatever regulation comes in, more or less you'll be complied with it. It's a question of putting documents together, and the ones that you wouldn't have to go through, which becomes a very, very difficult task. Yes.
It is soul deadening.
Yeah.
You know, who enjoys working in a place like that?
Yeah,
and that is a far bigger damage. Yes. You can manage with 50% of the time, yes. But if your soul is crushed, yes, then everything is gone.
Exactly. That's the point, sir. I think that's what Mr. Damodaran also. That's why this topic also what comes together. But thank you for your comments, sir.
Any other question or comment that anybody wants to add to the dialogue discussion? Nilesh, you have been on the boards of many companies, I know, regulated, unregulated. Maybe you want to share a perspective.
I didn't want to share publicly, but anyway, just to sort of support what Mr. Damodaran is saying. Recently, I was talking to a CEO of a bank, and the amount of days he has to attend meetings is roughly about, I think, more than 100 days, 120 days. Now, when does he do business? The topic is, do managements also run business? If the CEO of and this is other than the audit committee, which is not supposed to attend, the other committees, the number of committees which are there. And even as I would say independent directors of bank, the amount of time which goes into the diverse, set of meetings. So when the managements are there. So again, that question, when do they run the business? So there are, challenges. And unfortunately today, there are some other incidences where the regulators have gone overboard. When there's a very clearly laid down law, they've gone over and above the law. The way today courts sometimes interpret law in their own manner, even the regulators have started doing that. And then they say they'll see in the courts, what's happened. So that is putting a lot of strain on the corporates, and a lot of decision making, if I can say so. I don't want to elaborate more right now.
No, thank you. I think it's a perspective.
Mr. George.
Please.
I'm George here. A very interesting incident, personal experience in compliance versus value addition in boards. When I learned governance, I wanted to introduce, strategy, etc. upfront and compliance later. I had one director, he said, no, compliance has to be seen because it affects us personally, takes a lot of time. So in short, I formed a compliance committee with him as the chairman. So the previous day he will come, sit with the secretarial department, goes through everything. And the moment he tells on the board, I have gone through over 5 minutes, compliance is over. Yep. So we could get into real business discussion. So a compliance committee, though not a part of a regulatory thing, can help us sometimes. That's the point I want to share. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I can't see into the glare. Yes.
Yep. I think there's a question over there.
There's a question there. Somebody raised there.
Mr. Sethi has a question. Yeah.
No, I was just saying that what you have highlighted, that do managements also run business, implying that, they're really not getting the time, etc. And there are real pressures of market forces which compete with the regulatory requirements, etc. I think that's the same point that Mr. Vikram Mehta was making in the other, and he made it very vividly, because ESG is one form of that regulation which is debilitating. And Mr. Aga also made the point that it's not just the time commitment, that's one part. In fact, you can actually take care of that part by straightening out your compliance management system once you set it right with real earnestness, knowing that if you get it right, you will have the time which you can then employ in business. That can be sorted out. But when your heart and soul is not in, complying with the regulation because you think it's not very useful, what purpose is it serving? And you're doing it because you are just required to do, that I think is a much more crushing kind of a strain that the managements go through. And I think getting the balance right is very, very critical. And in that context, in the morning session, I think what Mr. Bhatia said was very relevant, that our endeavor is to get the balance right, and I hope over time that we will see that day when this question will perhaps become somewhat irrelevant.
I mean, I'll give you a perspective on number of consultation papers which come out. I mean, just look at the number of consultation papers which have come out in the recent last few years.
10 days time to respond.
With 10 days time to respond, I think look at just a topic like ESG and see how many consultation papers have come in the last 2.5 years only on ESG. And I think this is areas where you then start wondering, because you are building business models, you're running, trying to build a company on that. I think areas where maybe there has to be some balance. And how do you draw that balance?
I am reminded of two lines of poetry. And many of you would have heard this. What is this world if so full of care, we have no time to stand and stare? And I think those lines were written for modern day chief executives. Do they actually get time to sit back, take a deep breath, look around them? Or are their heads buried in manuals, books, and what have you? And I'm more worried about the financial sector because decisions have been taken away from them and they are being operated, I hate to say this, like puppets. Somebody else is pulling the strings from somewhere else. And we believe that great things are happening. We heard good statements in the morning. If half that talk is walked, we would be a great country.
No, in fact, I mean, sorry, I'll just share this. So I had met somebody who had just stepped down as the chief executive of a large regulated entity. And he said, Amish, I am happy to join in any advisory capacity for any regulated entity, but I will not join a board of any regulated entity. He says, in my experience, given what I have seen of how the regulators are looking at, and I think this is a perspective. And I'm not saying everything is in that light, but I think, and this is also something which is highlighted. If you want good people to, good leaders to run these organizations, you want good directors to be on the boards of these companies, you will need to find a balance on some of these aspects. Otherwise, it will be very difficult. And maybe I want to come to you just, Tapan, on the DNO insurance, right? I mean, all of us look at DNO responsibility and then want to cover the liabilities for our officers, our directors. Have you seen any change in the last few years in terms of expectation from companies?
Yeah, there's been an increase in demand of D&O and the limits have gone up. So there have been cases also which have got triggered, claims have started getting paid. So if I look at, let's say, 10 years back, 15 years back, nobody even knew what a D&O policy is. Nobody spoke about it also. Then people got aware about it. Some started thinking about it. Now every director on the board will ask what's the limit that is there and is the policy there or not. No? So we have seen a huge shift in the D&O policy which has been there, which shows, and it actually reconfirms the statement that directors are worried when they sit on board today, and they're worried that things may go wrong. Now when they're worried, they will go overboard. It's a human, it's a natural human reaction, no? If you're worried about something, you will go overboard. When you go overboard, then the management has to respond to you, you're the director. So they will go overboard trying to respond to you, and then it becomes a negative cycle which keeps on moving up. No? So I think it's not a question of just a balance on these two. This will never happen. The question is beyond that, that should directors be afraid because of all the regulations, law, which come on their responsibility of what they can do. And can they technically do all that stuff? No, what has been put? I think that is the first question which should be asked. Can a director do what is being stipulated for the director to be done by the regulator or by the act or by the law? If the answer is no, in the time you give the director, let's say a 5-hour window or a 1-day window, then let's first look into that, no? Because if you're scaring the director and the director is scared, the director will scare the management, then you keep on hitting this loop and the regulator will keep on getting more scared and keep on adding more. So I think we are in a distrust kind of environment where everybody, is distrusting the whole system and you're trying to bring in more and more rules to bring in trust. I don't think it works like that. The evolution has to be on a constant basis, that you have to keep on looking at what's become obsolete, drop it. What is required, right? If I look at your talk, the opening remark you gave, you mentioned about the cyber is coming in, you mentioned about generative AI coming in. You're looking at how business responds to that coming in. Now, does any regulation encourage that companies look into this or do that? Or are they looking at transformative business? The answer is no. Regulations still work on incidents of the past, and they keep on putting layering and scare the director. I think this is the bigger worry and concern, and how do you address this as a fundamental issue before we look into something else. That's my thinking.
Just to add to what Tapan is saying, the expectation of the independent directors today from most of the regulators, they should be more like an executive position.
Yeah.
It's not in the law. If you look at the Companies Act or you look at the Schedule 4, etc., what the roles and responsibilities of the independent directors, there's nothing mentioned. It's more a broad oversight, and unless they're culpable, they'll not be held. But today, under the underlying, the way the inspection reports come or the other matters come up, the expectation is more an executive position. And I think here, possibly a dialogue is required with the regulators, because what is happening is, my understanding is they're working in silos. So what are the challenges of independent directors? What are the roles responsible of independent directors? Some failure happens, and that becomes the base for coming out of the new standard or a new expectation from the directors. What are the independent directors doing? Apart from auditors, the next session is on the auditors, which we'll of course be hearing. So auditors, independent directors. Now, first time, there has been some focus on what is the CFO doing. There's not much debate on the management as of now, but I think that's it's going towards that area. But I think the expectation of directors, which is more like an executive position, they want the directors to be functional,
so
independent directors.
So the takeaway from our panel could be that I think there has to be a body discussing regulators from an independent directors body. Nobody's doing that also. So if you look at it, this pressure coming on independent directors, and they have no voice. See, as a management, I have a voice. I can still go and talk to a regulator. I can still go and put the case and say this is wrong, this is right. Let's reform it, let's look into it. But I've never seen independent directors have a voice with regulators where they go and say, how can we do this? You do it and tell us how to do it. If we can't do it, then why the hell are we getting into this? I think if there's one takeaway which can actually set the ball rolling in the reverse direction for where it is going negatively, it would be this, is my belief. Yeah.
I mean, there are committees, but and there are responses for white papers, but maybe, sir.
I think if you dropped somebody from space, some visitor from another planet landed in India, and after he looked around and interacted with the corporates, you asked him, he has no prior knowledge, no baggage. You asked him who runs companies in India. The honest answer might be audit committees and independent directors. I don't think you'll hear anybody say managements run companies. Maybe the question we should ask ourselves is not, do managements also run business, but should managements also be allowed to run business? That, I think, is the problem statement.
Thank you. So, I think with that, and enriching conversation with both Tapan and Mr. Damodaran, thank you very much for listening to some of our thoughts and for sharing your perspective. Sorry. Yes, Mr. Raga.
ChatGPT had said mistakenly, but that is the common wisdom, that it is the board which decides strategy, and in fact the boards are not capable of deciding strategy. And companies will crash land if independent directors and boards start.
So there has to be more board members like you.
In fact, the only regulator or ex-regulator whom I've ever heard confirm that is Mr. Damodaran, who says it is not the job of the board to run companies.
No, I think with Mr. Damodaran as my board member, I had the best time.
Managements are the first draftsmen of strategy because management is a seat of knowledge. They are the ones that know the domain, know competition, know markets, etc., etc.
So actually what ChatGPT
Board
spoke,
only
sorry.
helps to refine strategy. What is important is when you finalize it, both of them should co-own that final product. The management shouldn't say the board did this, the board shouldn't say we have nothing to do with it, management did this. But the initial exercise, the first draft, has to obviously be the management's.
I agree. In fact, board can be a good sparring partner. It can
Exactly.
put guardrails, but eventually company will run well if the top management.
No,
with
I
the
think that,
backing of the board.
no, I think that's exactly what should be. What ChatGPT actually did was just read out the act, sir. It did not do it. It was just theoretical. That's what Mr. Damodaran mentioned. So in the act, it's mentioned what exactly read out, sir. So that is where the problem should come. That's why I'm saying the problem is inherent in that. Nobody challenges that and says, why should it be like this? I think that is where it has to start from. And I'm
That's
very
what
happy.
we are trying to address.
Yes, sir.
here.
Right, sir. Thank
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Thank you, Tapan, for this enriching conversation. Thank you, everybody.
So thank you so much, Mr. Mehta and Mr. Singhel, for providing very useful insights. May now request Mr. Thomas Matthew to please present a memento to each panelist. Well, on behalf of each panelist, Excellence Enablers is proud to have sponsored education for one girl child for 1 full year through the NGO Nanni Kali, a Mahindra initiative. Once again, thanks to all our panelists.